Welcome to Whispers of Asia, where every story you hear was never meant to be told. Here, the shadows speak in voices older than the mountains, carrying tales of forgotten rituals, cursed places, and spirits that wait for the living to wander too close. We don't just tell ghost stories, we let them breathe. In a remote mountain village in Sichuan, there stands a temple that holds no books, only shelves lined with urns of pale gray ash. The monks say each urn was once a sacred manuscript, burned in an ancient purge. But the villagers whisper a darker truth, that the ashes are not only from books, but from the scribes who wrote them. And every year, during Ghost Month, the dead take up their brushes again. If you wake to find an ash page by your bed, the words will begin to write your story until you vanish, leaving only an urn in your place. The mountains of Sichuan rise like ancient slumbering beasts, their jagged spines cutting through a sky that is almost always shrouded in white. Nestled deep within one of these folds lies a village so remote that it appears on no modern maps. The only road leading to it is little more than a narrow ribbon of dirt carved into the side of the mountain, a treacherous path that winds endlessly, vanishing and reappearing inside coils of mist. Travelers who take it often say they feel as though they are not approaching a destination, but being swallowed by it. The fog here is not the gentle morning haze found in lowland towns. It is heavy, wet, and deliberate, clinging to clothes and skin until even one's own breath feels foreign. Every inhalation tastes faintly of moss and old stone. Somewhere deep beneath that scent lies something stranger, an acrid undertone, like burnt paper long cooled, but never forgotten. The village itself is a huddle of dark wooden houses, their tiled roofs sagging under the weight of years. Narrow alleyways twist between them like veins, and in those shadows the villagers move quietly, their eyes lowered whenever they pass a stranger. They speak in hushed tones, their words swallowed by the mist before they can travel more than a few steps. Even the children are subdued. Instead of playing in the open square, they watch from behind half-shuttered windows, their small faces pale and still, vanishing whenever they are noticed. At the farthest edge of the settlement, past terraced fields that seem permanently damp, stands a building that does not belong to any living village. The villagers never point to it, never name it aloud, but its silhouette is inescapable. The dark outline of a temple, its roof sweeping upward like frozen wings, its walls blackened and cracked. Time and fire have left their marks here. The great wooden doors are scorched, their carvings charred into ghostly impressions, yet the structure stands unbowed, as though some will stronger than stone holds it together. Those who dare speak of it at all call it the Library of Ash. By daylight, it is only a ruin, but when night comes, the air around it thickens, and a strange sound creeps into the fog, a faint, deliberate scratching, like the tip of a calligraphy brush moving across paper. It is never hurried, never loud, but it carries a weight that sinks into the bones of anyone who hears it. Sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, the scent of charred parchment drifts from the library's half-open doorway, mingling with the dry sweetness of extinguished incense. It is a scent so strong that even those passing far down the road have been known to pause, certain that a fire still smolders within. But no fire burns there, not anymore. The elders whisper of a time 4 centuries ago when the temple was a sanctuary for scribes. Here they copied sacred manuscripts, some said to contain truths too dangerous for the outside world. When the imperial decree came to destroy all heretical writings, the soldiers came with torches, but they did not stop at the books. The scribes themselves were bound and thrown into the flames. The ashes of parchment and human flesh were gathered, sealed in urns, and arranged neatly upon shelves inside the library. Each urn was labeled in the script the scribes once used, a script no living person could read. The villagers say the ashes still hold the souls of those burned, bound to guard their words for all eternity. And every year, during Ghost Month, those souls write again, not with ink, but with what remains of themselves. No one stays inside the library after dark, no one but the desperate or the doomed. On certain nights, when the fog curls thickest around the temple walls, travelers have reported seeing a dim glow deep within, as if hundreds of tiny lanterns were being lit in unison. But the villagers know better. They say it is not lantern light, but the embers of 1,000 brushes moving across ash paper, recording words that were never meant for the living to read. And those who do not remain among the living for long. The first time the stranger saw the village, it appeared to him not as a place to be entered, but as a shadow suspended in the fog, a silhouette without edges. He had been walking the mountain road for hours, his boots heavy with damp earth, his breath curling into the gray air like fading ink strokes on a cold page. His name was Li Wei, though in the academic circles of Chengdu, he was known less for his modest lectures than for his obsession, lost languages. He had spent years chasing fragments of writing across forgotten ruins and dusty monasteries, piecing together scripts that had no place in modern tongues. When he first heard of a library of ashes in an offhand remark from an elderly calligrapher, he thought it only a poetic metaphor. But the old man's expression, a flicker of fear quickly hidden, told him there was more beneath the words. It had taken months to trace the rumors to this place. The journey was not simple. Each village along the way had pointed him deeper into the mountains with a shrug or a muttered warning. Too far, too empty, too many ghosts. By the time he reached the final path, the mist was so dense he could barely see the tips of his fingers. The village revealed itself reluctantly. First came the faint smell, damp wood, smoke long since gone cold, and something sharper, bitterer. Then came the sound of water dripping from a warped roof. Finally, shapes began to form. Rooftops bowed under the weight of years, walls leaning into each other as though whispering secrets. People watched him from doorways and narrow windows, their expressions unreadable in the pale light. Some nodded faintly in greeting, but none approached. When he asked an old man about lodging, the villager simply pointed toward the main square and turned away, muttering under his breath. The inn was nothing more than a creaking two-story house, its walls stained with age. The innkeeper, a woman with a face like weathered bark and eyes that did not quite meet his, took his coins without a word and handed him a brass key. The room she gave him smelled faintly of damp cloth and something else, burnt, faint but there. He unpacked slowly, placing his notebooks on the desk by the window. Through the mist, he could just make out the outline of the far edge of the village. And there it was, the temple. Even from this distance, its blackened wood seemed to drink in the light. Its roofline rose above the surrounding houses like a relic of some other world, a place both sacred and violated. He felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as though the air itself carried whispers meant only for him. At dusk, he wandered toward the market square. It was little more than a scattering of stalls selling vegetables, dried herbs, and bundles of incense. He asked casually about the temple at the edge of the village. Every conversation died the moment the words left his mouth. One man pretended not to hear. Another muttered, "Ghost month," and spat on the ground before walking away. But Li Wei was not deterred. He had come too far to turn back. And besides, he had begun to notice something strange, the way the villagers' eyes darted toward the temple even when they tried not to. Fear, yes, but also something else. Expectation. That night, as the fog thickened and the last lanterns were snuffed out, Li Wei lay in his narrow bed staring at the ceiling. Somewhere beyond the walls, the village shifted and sighed in its sleep, and faintly, almost too faint to trust, he thought he heard it. The soft, deliberate sound of brush on paper, coming from the direction of the temple. The fog was thinner in the early morning, though it still clung to the streets like an old superstition. Li Wei rose before dawn, unable to shake the memory of the faint brushstroke sounds from the night before. The village was quiet. Even the crows in the trees seemed hesitant to break the silence. The path to the temple wound between leaning houses and out past the last vegetable gardens, where the ground turned to slick stone. From here, the air was colder, carrying the same faint burnt paper scent he had noticed since his arrival, only now it was stronger, denser, as if the building ahead exhaled it. The Library of Ash loomed above him. Its roof tiles were warped and cracked, the wooden beams blackened as if licked by a fire that had been both merciless and deliberate. The great doors stood slightly ajar, their surface etched with charred patterns that might once have been carvings, but now looked like scars. He pushed gently. The hinges groaned, not from rust, but from something older, heavier, as though the door itself resented being opened. The interior swallowed the daylight whole. At first he could make out only shapes, long parallel rows rising from floor to ceiling. Not shelves of books, not at all. Urns. Thousands of ceramic urns, each one dull gray, each one sealed, and each bearing a faded paper label written in the same unfamiliar script. They lined the walls like silent sentinels, their arrangement meticulous, almost ceremonial. The air inside was stale and still, the kind of stillness that suggested it had been holding its breath for centuries. Li Wei stepped closer to one of the shelves. The urn before him was smooth and cold to the touch. Its label had been brushed in broad, confident strokes, yet the characters meant nothing to him. Not yet. He pulled out his notebook, copying the shapes with care, feeling a strange unease as his pen traced their curves. There was a rhythm to the space, not the movement of people, but something deeper, almost a pulse. He became aware of the faintest sound, so quiet he thought at first it was in his head, a dry, papery whisper, as if ash itself were shifting inside the urns. In the far corner of the room stood a tall altar, blackened like everything else. On it rested a single unsealed urn, smaller than the others, its mouth covered only by a square of thin cloth weighed down with a smooth river stone. The cloth was trembling very slightly, though there was no breeze. He took a cautious step forward. That was when he noticed the floor. It was littered with thin, brittle fragments, gray and weightless, flakes of something that might once have been paper, now reduced to ash. They formed faint trails leading from the shelves toward the center of the room, like footsteps left by something that was not flesh. Li Wei crouched and picked up one of the flakes. It dissolved instantly between his fingers, leaving a faint black smudge on his skin. His heart pounded. He could feel it, the same sensation as running his hand over an old manuscript, except here the words had already died. And yet, they were still here. He backed away toward the door, the scent of burnt parchment pressing close around him. As his eyes adjusted further, he realized that the urns weren't identical. Some had fresh labels, their ink dark and sharp, unlike the faded ones around them. Someone, or something, was still adding to the collection. From somewhere deep inside the library, behind the rows of urns, came that sound again, the slow, deliberate scrape of a calligraphy brush. Li Wei told himself he was staying for research, that the only way to understand the library was to observe it when the villagers refused to go near. But the truth was more complicated. There was something in that quiet scratching sound that hooked into him, the way a half-forgotten melody can haunt a dream. That night, the village square emptied early. Lanterns were doused before their oil was spent, and shutters closed with an almost frantic urgency. From his room in the inn, Li Wei could hear the way the silence settled. Not natural, but imposed. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. When the moon rose pale behind the fog, he made his way back to the temple. The path felt different at night, as though it had grown longer. Each step seemed to carry him further away from the living and deeper into something else. The air was colder now, sharp with that burnt paper scent until it coated his tongue. Inside, the library greeted him with the same stillness, the urns glimmering faintly in the weak moonlight that spilled through cracks in the roof. He found a spot near the back wall, leaning against one of the lower shelves, his notebook ready, a lantern at his feet. The flame flickered nervously, as if it too didn't want to be here. For hours, nothing happened. His thoughts began to drift. The sound of his own heartbeat seemed too loud. Then, from somewhere beyond the nearest row of urns, it came. The brush. Slow. Measured. A stroke. Pause. Another stroke. The sound was impossibly clear, though he could see no one moving in the pale light. He froze, afraid even his breathing might disturb it. The scratching went on for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. A silence followed that was thicker than before, pressing in from all sides. Li Wei's skin prickled, a cold sweat forming at the base of his neck. Something shifted beside him. He looked down. On the floor, lying neatly by his feet, was a sheet of paper. No, not paper. It was too fragile, too gray, its surface mottled and uneven. It looked as though it had been pressed from ash itself, the grains still visible in the texture. Across it, written in perfect black strokes, was a language he did not know. The characters were sharp, deliberate, almost beautiful, and yet wrong, their proportions unsettling in a way he couldn't name. When he reached for it, a shock of heat ran through his fingertips, so quick and subtle he almost thought he imagined it. But the mark was real. A faint smear of black remained on his skin, as if the ash had tried to cling to him. He turned the sheet over. The back was blank, but the surface crumbled slightly under his touch, leaving a tiny drift of ash on the floorboards. A sound behind him, the faintest breath, made him spin around. No one, only the urns, lined in their silent ranks. When he looked back down, the page seemed different. The characters had shifted, only slightly, but enough to make his stomach tighten, as if they had been waiting for him to look away so they could arrange themselves into something else. He placed the sheet carefully into his notebook, though part of him felt as if he were carrying something alive. Then he noticed something that made his throat go dry. A thin trail of ash led from the page all the way to the nearest urn, and on that urn's faded paper label, he saw fresh ink, the same style, the same hand as what was now in his possession. The next morning, the fog was thinner, but the village still felt as though it had been wrapped in wet cloth overnight. The air clung to him, heavy and sour with the lingering taste of burnt paper. Li Wei left the inn early, the ash page from the night before tucked between the pages of his notebook. He had hardly slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the characters shifting, rearranging themselves in darkness. The market square was awake, but subdued. A few stalls offered vegetables glistening with dew. baskets of dried mushrooms and bundles of incense sticks tied with red string. The villagers moved with quiet efficiency, speaking in short, hushed phrases that dissolved into the mist. He was buying tea from a stooped old man when he heard it, a woman's voice, brittle yet deliberate, calling to him from the far edge of the square. "You've been to the library." He turned. Sitting cross-legged on a worn mat was a woman dressed in layers of faded indigo cloth. Her hair was white and unbound, spilling over her shoulders like tangled thread. A strip of black silk covered her eyes, but her face was tilted toward him with unsettling precision, as if she could see far more than those with sight. Li Wei hesitated. How do you—" She smiled faintly, revealing teeth the color of old parchment. "I can smell it. The ash stays on you. It gets into your clothes, into your breath, into your blood." A small crowd gathered at a distance, pretending to shop while keeping their ears tilted toward the conversation. The woman beckoned him closer, her thin fingers curling like claws. "Show me what it gave you," she said. Li Wei's hand tightened around his notebook. "Why?" "Because you don't know what you're holding, and because it already knows your name." Reluctantly, he slid the ash page from between the notebook's leaves. The woman didn't touch it. Instead, she leaned forward and inhaled deeply, her covered eyes fluttering as if in pain. "The words are still alive. They are looking for a body," she whispered. Li Wei frowned. "What does that mean?" She lifted her chin slightly, listening to something he couldn't hear. Then she smiled without warmth. "The urns in the library, they are not only filled with the ashes of manuscripts. The scribes were burned with their work, mixed together so that their spirits would never let the words escape. When the writing calls to someone, it is not a gift, it is an invitation. Once you start to understand it, it will come for you. And when it finishes its story, you will be inside the urn too." Her voice had grown so quiet that he had to lean closer to hear the final words. 7 days. That's how long it takes. You have one of them already." Li Wei felt an involuntary shiver crawl up his spine. "One of what?" She tilted her head, listening to something he couldn't hear. Then she smiled without warmth. "One of the pages of your own ending." Without another word, she turned away, running her fingers over the wooden beads hanging at her side, murmuring something in a dialect he couldn't place. The crowd dispersed as if nothing had happened, though more than one villager avoided meeting his eyes as he passed. As Li Wei walked back toward the inn, he glanced at his notebook. For a moment, he could have sworn the black strokes on the ash page had grown darker. Li Wei left the village the next morning, telling himself it was only for a short trip. The truth was, the blind woman's words had lodged deep in his mind, and he needed the comfort of the outside world, a place where people spoke openly and the air didn't carry the taste of burning. He took the winding road down the mountain, the mist clinging to him like a scent he couldn't wash off. By late afternoon, he reached the outskirts of Chengdu, the city's noise and smoke pressing in around him like a tide. Here, the streets were crowded. Vendors called out their prices, and carts rattled past with clanging wheels. But even here, Li Wei felt the weight of the page in his satchel, as though it were not an object, but a living passenger. His first stop was the university library. In a cramped office smelling of ink and tea, Professor Han, an aging linguist with a reputation for stubborn brilliance, peered through round spectacles at the ash page Li Wei laid before him. The old man frowned. "Where did you get this?" "An old temple library in the mountains," Li Wei said carefully. "I'm researching archaic scripts. Can you identify it?" Han leaned closer, the thin skin around his eyes creasing as he traced the strokes without touching the page. "It's strange. At first glance, I thought it was a variant of ancient Shu script, but some characters resemble early Tang calligraphy. And here," he pointed to a looping symbol that looked almost serpentine. "This is older, pre-Qin possibly, but the forms have been altered." "Altered how?" Li Wei asked. "As if they were rewritten by someone who remembered them imperfectly, or someone who wasn't meant to remember them at all." Han sat back, rubbing his chin. "It's a composite. Whoever wrote this drew from multiple dead languages, one separated by centuries, even millennia. That shouldn't be possible." Li Wei hesitated and then said, "What if it wasn't recent?" Han gave him a sharp look. "How old is this page?" Li Wei opened his mouth, then closed it. The truth, that it had appeared beside him in the night, seemed impossible to explain without sounding insane. The professor tapped the edge of the sheet. "There's something else. See these faint marks behind the main strokes, like shadows? They're not decorative. I've seen them once before in funerary inscriptions meant to bind a soul to a physical object." Li Wei felt a chill run down his spine. Bind a soul? Han nodded slowly. "It's a superstition, but the idea is that the writing acts as a vessel. The soul cannot move on as long as the words exist." Li Wei laughed. "That's just folklore." "Perhaps," Han said, then more quietly, "but I would not keep this with you if I were you." They spoke a little longer, but Han could offer no translation, only fragments of meaning, a handful of words: keep, hold, replace. When Li Wei left, the professor avoided touching the page entirely, as though some instinct warned him. Back at his rented room in the city, Li Wei laid the ash page on the desk. Under the electric light, the black ink seemed thicker than before, as if it had seeped deeper into the fibers. He leaned closer and noticed something he had not seen before. Between the lines, in the faintest gray, new marks had appeared. Not full characters, just beginnings of strokes, as though the page were writing itself. That night, as he drifted toward sleep, he dreamed of a brush hovering over his chest, dipping into a well of darkness where his heart should be. The bristles were warm, almost burning, and with each stroke, something inside him felt lighter, as though it were being lifted out, line by line. When he woke, his bedsheet was dusted with a fine layer of gray ash. 2 days later, Li Wei was back on the narrow road into the mountains. Chengdu's noise had not silenced the weight pressing against his chest. If anything, it had grown heavier. The ash page was still with him, sealed in his notebook, though he had considered more than once leaving it behind. Each time, the thought felt wrong, as if abandoning it would be like leaving part of himself to rot somewhere far away. The fog welcomed him back before the village itself did. By the time the first rooftops appeared, that same burnt paper scent had settled into his lungs. The villagers' reactions were no warmer than before. If anything, their glances were sharper now, like people seeing a man walking willingly toward a cliff. He headed for the market, hoping to find the blind woman again, but her mat in the corner was empty. In her place was a stall selling dried roots. The woman behind it averted her gaze when he asked about the blind one, mumbling something about not being here anymore and turning away. The innkeeper seemed reluctant to rent him the same room, but took his coins without comment. As he unpacked, he noticed something new, a thin layer of ash clinging to the windowsill inside his room. He brushed it away, but when he turned back, A few gray specks had already returned, carried on air that didn't seem to move. That afternoon, he struck up a conversation with a man repairing fishing nets near the edge of the square. At first, the man was friendly, even curious about Li Wei's work, but when the library was mentioned, his expression hardened. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, "especially not during Ghost Month. I've heard the stories about the scribes, the ashes, but have people actually gone missing?" The man's hand stilled. He glanced over his shoulder before speaking again. "3 that I know of. A tourist from Guangzhou 2 summers ago, a traveling merchant maybe 10 years back, and a boy from the next valley. He was only 17. "What happened to them?" Li Wei asked. The man's gaze shifted towards the direction of the temple. "They spent nights there, same as you. They left saying they'd found something worth studying, worth taking home. Then they got sick, coughing, spitting black, weak in the legs. And on the 7th day, he stopped, swallowing hard. They were gone. No footprints, no struggle, just gone. And in the library, a new urn would be waiting, always with a fresh label." Li Wei felt the words like cold water down his spine. "You've seen the urns yourself?" The man nodded. "I helped carry one once, heavy, though the ashes inside can't weigh much. And when I touched it, my fingertips stayed black for 3 days." He looked at Li Wei then, his voice dropping. "You have the look of them, you know, the ones before. Skin a little paler, breathing a little shallower. If I were you, I'd leave before the library decides it's time to make space for another urn." The rest of the day passed in uneasy quiet. By dusk, the fog thickened again, curling low around the houses. From his window, he could just make out the temple silhouette. For a moment, he thought he saw movement inside, a faint flicker of light, and then the distinct shape of someone standing between the shelves. Only the figure wasn't holding a lantern. They were holding a brush. The village slept early that evening, the streets empty long before the moon had climbed above the mountains. From his window, Li Wei watched the last door shut, the last lantern fade, until the only glow came from the mist itself, a pale, shifting light that seemed to move with the fog's slow breath. The image of the figure with the brush would not leave him. Whether it had been real or some trick of shadow, he could not say, but the pull toward the library was stronger than ever. The blind woman's warning and the fisherman's grim story should have kept him away. Instead, they only sharpened his curiosity until it became something close to need. Near midnight, he lit a small lantern and made his way to the temple. The path was silent, except for his own steps and the occasional drip of water from unseen eaves. The burnt paper scent was heavier tonight, curling into his lungs until each breath felt like it left a trace inside him. The doors gave their usual low groan as he pushed them open. Moonlight spilled in, pooling weakly across the floor, but most of the library remained in shadow. The rows of urns stood in perfect stillness, their faded labels barely visible. He set his lantern down, its glow trembling in the stale air. The silence was so complete that the faintest sound carried, the tiny scrape of his shoes against the wood, the whisper of his own breathing. Then it came again, brush on paper. Slow, deliberate strokes, as if the writer had all the time in the world. The sound seemed to shift location as he moved, always just beyond the next row of shelves. He followed it deeper, weaving through narrow aisles, his fingers brushing the cold ceramic of the urns as he passed. Some were warm to the touch. He did not linger on them. The sound stopped. In the aisle's dead end, on the floor before him, lay another page. This one was darker than the first, the gray almost charcoal, as though more ash had been pressed into its making. The characters on it were not arranged in neat columns this time. They spiraled outward from the center in tightening loops, pulling the eye inward until he felt almost dizzy. In the spiral's heart was a single symbol, sharp, jagged, unlike any script he'd ever seen. Looking at it made his vision blur at the edges. He knelt, hesitating before picking it up. The moment his fingertips touched the surface, a heat flared in his skin, sharper than before, and for a second the page seemed to tremble as if alive. The black strokes pulsed faintly, their edges shifting like something breathing. A cough tore through his chest, sudden and dry. He clamped a hand over his mouth, but when he pulled it away, a dusting of fine black ash clung to his palm. His lungs burned with each breath as if he had inhaled smoke moments ago. When he looked back at the page, the spiral seemed to have expanded, the central symbol pushing outward. The characters along the edge were different now, their shapes curling into something almost like letters in his own language. He could swear the first word was forming, and it was his name. He shoved the page into his notebook and turned to leave, but his lantern's flame shuddered violently, almost going out. A shift in the air made him stop. Between two shelves, half hidden in shadow, a figure stood watching him. Tall, robed, head bowed. In one hand, a brush. In the other, an urn. The figure didn't move, but Li Wei felt an undeniable certainty. The urn was not empty.
Li Wei did not sleep that night. He left the library with his lantern shaking in his hand, the second ash page pressed flat in his notebook, and the image of the shadowed figure burned into his mind. Back in his room, the fog pressed against the window as if listening. At first light, he went searching for answers. The blind woman was still nowhere to be found, but he spotted the fisherman from before, sitting on an upturned crate and repairing a net with slow, deliberate motions. When Li Wei asked about the figure in the library, the man gave a short, bitter laugh.
"You've seen one of them," he said. "A guardian scribe."
Li Wei sat beside him. What are they guarding? The man tied off a knot, then looked toward the mountains as though the story lived there. 400 years ago, during the late Ming, the emperor sent soldiers to every corner of the land to burn what he called words of poison, scrolls, books, anything that spoke against the throne or taught forbidden rites. But here, his voice lowered, here the soldiers found something worse. A library kept by monks and scholars who wrote in a script older than any dynasty, a language said to have come from the spirits themselves. They refused to hand over their work, so the soldiers made an example. Li Wei listened, the man's words weaving through the market's morning stillness. They didn't just burn the books, they bound the scribes one by one and threw them into the flames with their manuscripts. When the fires died, they gathered every grain of ash, book and body, together and sealed them in urns. The emperor's order was to scatter them into rivers and fields, but the officer here, he disobeyed. He had the urns placed back on the shelves where the books had been, and he locked the doors. "Why?" Li Wei asked. The fisherman's eyes were dark. "Because he believed the dead would guard their words better than the living ever could." He leaned closer. "That's the curse. The souls were bound to the ash by the very ink they had used in life. They can't leave, not while their writing remains. And so they keep writing, adding to the library long after their bodies turn to dust." Li Wei felt a chill settle in his bones. What happens to someone who reads the pages? They take your breath first, the man said flatly. The black in your lungs is the ash taking root. Then they take your voice, and when you've no breath left to speak or scream, they take the rest. By the seventh night, your urn will be waiting on a shelf, always with your name. A long silence passed between them. In the distance, the fog was beginning to roll down the slope toward the village again, swallowing the rooftops one by one. The fisherman glanced toward the temple. "You've already started coughing, haven't you?" Li Wei didn't answer, but the roughness in his chest betrayed him. The man sighed. "Then you better burn what they've given you before it finishes its story." Li Wei almost laughed at the irony. To destroy the page felt unthinkable, but to keep it was to invite death. Yet even as he considered the advice, his fingers itched to take the notebook from his bag and look at the spiral of characters again. It was then he realized something that made his stomach clench. The second page was heavier than it had been the night before, as though it had gathered more ash. By the next morning, Li Wei could no longer pretend the cough was just from the mountain air. It came in sharp bursts now, scraping his throat raw, leaving behind the bitter taste of smoke. Each time he spat into the wash basin, the water swirled gray, a dusting of fine black settling at the bottom like sediment from some ancient river. The fog outside was heavier than usual, pooling low in the streets and curling into doorways. When Li Wei stepped out of the inn, it clung to him like damp cloth. Every breath felt weighted, as though the air was thickened by invisible ash. He caught the wary glances of villagers as he passed. A few made subtle hand gestures, warding off ill fortune. He was beginning to recognize that look, the one they had for people who would not last the week. The market was quiet. Most stalls were shuttered, their owners hidden inside. The only movement came from a lone child sitting on a stone step, drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. As Li Wei walked past, he noticed the shapes were not random. They were characters, crooked and incomplete, but unsettlingly familiar. "Where did you learn that?" Li Wei asked. The boy shrugged. "It was in my dream. The man with no face showed me." Li Wei's chest tightened. "What man?" But the boy only smiled, revealing teeth flecked with ash. Before Li Wei could say more, a woman, his mother perhaps, rushed forward, pulling the child away without a word. The cough came again, bending him forward until his vision swam. When it eased, he noticed something alarming. The skin of his fingertips was smudged with black that wouldn't rub off, as if the ash had begun to stain him from the inside. He returned to his room and set the 2 pages on the desk. In daylight, the writing seemed hungrier. The first page's neat columns now leaned slightly inward, the gaps between characters narrowing as though the words were closing ranks. On the second page, the spiral had expanded outward, the central jagged symbol swelling into dominance, and there, at the outer edge, more letters from his own language, the beginning of a sentence, still incomplete. Li Wei will. He snapped the notebook shut, heart pounding. That night, the dreams returned. He stood in the library, the shelves of urns stretching higher than the eye could follow. Ash rained softly from above, coating his shoulders. A faceless figure approached, a brush in one hand, an empty urn in the other. The figure dipped the brush into the urn, into the ashes, and began to write directly across his chest. The strokes burned as they sank into his skin, and with each one, his breath came harder, shallower. When the figure finished, it pressed the urn into his hands. Li Wei awoke, gasping, his lungs aching, the taste of smoke thick on his tongue. Beside his bed, a thin trail of ash led to the desk and the notebook. It was open. The second page had finished its sentence. The next morning, Li Wei left the village before the fog had begun to thin. His cough was worse, deep enough now to rattle in his ribs. He kept a cloth pressed to his mouth as he walked, unwilling to let the villagers see the black stains it left behind. He wasn't heading toward the library this time. He was following the fisherman's advice. If you want to know how it started, look to the mountain's bones. An hour's climb along a narrow goat path brought him to a cliff face the color of old ash. The locals avoided this place, calling it the Silent Wall. No birds nested here, no plants clung to the rock. The air was still, heavy, as though sound itself had been stripped away. At first glance, the stone was bare, but when the morning light shifted, faint carvings emerged, shallow lines worn by centuries of wind and rain. Li Wei brushed away a thin crust of lichen with his sleeve, revealing a scene that made his skin crawl. It was a procession. Figures in flowing robes knelt before a large brazier, flames carved in curling spirals. Some held scrolls above their heads, others had their hands bound behind them. At the brazier's base, the carved smoke rose not as clouds, but as symbols, characters flowing upward into the air, merging with the shapes of human faces. Beneath the scene, an inscription in the same composite script as the ash pages read like an invocation. Li Wei copied it carefully into his notebook, the strokes tugging at his memory in a way that made his stomach tighten. He didn't notice the shadow until it moved. An old man stood a few paces away, leaning on a crooked staff. His eyes were sharp despite his years, and his voice, when he spoke, was steady. "You found the binding right," he said. Li Wei straightened. "The what?" The man approached, his gaze fixed on the carving. "They called it the ritual of silence. Words and souls burned together, so neither could be separated. The ink they used was mixed with bone dust. The fire fed on breath, on names. When the last cry left the body, the spirit stayed in the ash." Li Wei's throat tightened. Why? Why bind them? "To keep their words from escaping," the man replied. "To make them guardians forever. The emperor's men thought it was a punishment, but the scribes, some say they went willingly, believing it would keep their work alive." The old man's eyes narrowed at Li Wei's cough. "You've touched the pages, haven't you?" "Two." He sighed, tapping his staff against the rock. "Then the ash has already marked you. The more you read, the more it writes you into itself, until you are no longer a man with a name, but an urn with a label." The wind stirred then, the first movement in the air all morning, and a faint drift of black dust fell from the top of the cliff. It landed on Li Wei's hands, fine and soft as soot, but when he tried to brush it away, the marks remained like ink. The old man was already walking back toward the path. "If you want to live," he called over his shoulder, "you'll have to choose. Burn the pages or become one." Li Wei stood before the carving a moment longer, the ash clinging stubbornly to his skin, the inscription's strange rhythm echoing in his mind. In the stillness, he thought he heard a whisper, not from the wind, but from the stone itself. It was saying his name. By the time Li Wei returned to the village, his chest felt as if it were full of gravel. Each breath came shallow, each exhale wheezing through a throat lined with heat. The cough no longer waited for him to move or speak. It tore out of him at random, leaving the metallic taste of blood mixed with something far drier, like breathing the air of a long-dead fire. When he spat into the wash basin, the water turned cloudy, a fine black dust blooming outward before sinking to the bottom. He leaned on the table, staring at his trembling hands. The skin around his nails was gray now, not from dirt, but from something leaching up from within. He told himself he would stay inside, rest, avoid the library. But the air in his room was heavy, as if the walls were slowly closing in. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shelves, the urns, the silent rows watching him. And always, somewhere between waking and sleep, the faint scrape of a brush, the sound curling through the dark like a hand reaching for his ribs. That night, the dreams were sharper. He stood in the library's center, the floor coated in ash so deep it covered his shoes. Dozens of figures moved among the shelves, their faces hidden behind veils of soot. Their robes trailed across the floor, gathering more ash with each step. None of them spoke. None of them looked up. One of them broke away from the others, gliding toward him. It carried no lantern, no book, only an urn clasped tightly to its chest. When it stopped before him, the urn's lid loosened on its own, and a stream of ash rose upward in a slow spiral. The grains hovered in the air and then drifted toward his mouth like smoke seeking a chimney. He tried to turn away, but the ash followed, pressing past his lips, down his throat, filling his lungs until he could neither breathe nor scream. Inside his chest, the grains shifted, not randomly, but with purpose, arranging themselves into the shapes of letters. When he woke, he was on the floor beside his bed, his shirt clinging with sweat. He dragged himself upright and coughed violently. This time, what came out was not just dust. It was a small clump, solid enough to hold its shape for a second before collapsing into gray powder. And in the center of the pile, he saw it, a perfect, tiny, black character, one from the ash pages. His vision swam. He staggered to the desk, pulling out the notebook. The first page looked denser, the ink swollen and wet-looking, as though it had just been written. The second page's spiral had expanded again, and now the outermost ring had changed into words in his own language. Li Wei will return to the shelves. Before he could look away, the central jagged symbol pulsed, just once, but enough to send a sting of heat through his lungs, as if the page had reached into him to remind him where he was headed. The cough had taken on a rhythm of its own, coming in waves that left Li Wei dizzy and trembling. Every exhale seemed to carry more of him away, not just breath, but substance. The black smudges on his fingertips had spread to the lines of his palms, like ink seeping into a sheet of paper. He could not stay in the inn any longer. The walls pressed in on him, and the constant awareness of the notebook in the drawer was unbearable. The only thought that made sense, if any thought still did, was to return to the library and see it. The writer, the one whose brush scraped through his nights. The streets were deserted, though it was only early evening. Fog pooled around his legs, muting his footsteps as he made his way toward the temple. The burnt paper scent was stronger tonight, thick enough that it felt like he was walking inside the plume of some invisible fire. The doors gave their usual low groan as he stepped inside. His lantern's glow quivered across the rows of urns, their shadows stretching upward into the darkness like fingers. The air was cold, yet carried a strange heaviness, as if it resisted being moved. He didn't have to search for the sound. It was already there. Brush on paper. Slow, deliberate, unending. He moved toward it, weaving between the shelves. The sound grew clearer, no longer just noise, but layered like two brushes moving at once. The ash underfoot whispered with each step, fine grains shifting in tiny avalanches. Then he saw it. At a long, low table in the center of an open aisle, a figure sat hunched over a sheet of ash-gray paper. Robes the color of smoke hung from its shoulders, pooling on the floor. Its head was bowed, but when he circled to see its face, there was nothing there, only a smooth, pale surface where features should be, like an unfinished sculpture. The brush in its hand moved without pause, dipping into a small black bowl that gave off no scent, no steam. Each stroke bled impossibly dark into the ash sheet, the characters curling into shapes Li Wei recognized too well. It was his name, over and over, each one different, some complete, others twisting into forms he could not read. Between them were strokes from other languages, woven together into something seamless yet wrong. Li Wei's throat tightened. Why me? The faceless head tilted, as though listening. The brush paused for the first time. Then slowly, it turned the page toward him. The words at the top were in his language. The reader becomes the writer. The writer becomes the ash. Before he could speak, the brush moved again, writing a new line. The ink shimmered wetly in the lantern light. 7 nights. The figure lifted its free hand, and in it was an urn, smaller than the others, its label blank. The faceless head inclined toward him, as though inviting him to see where it would be placed on the shelves. A sudden cough racked his body, bending him forward. He tasted smoke, metallic and hot. When he looked at his palm, there was more than ash now, a thin smear of black liquid, as if his lungs had begun to bleed ink. When he looked back at the table, the figure was gone. Only the page remained, still wet, his name glistening in its center. The fisherman's words about the mountain's bones stayed in Li Wei's mind through the night. But it was the faceless scribe's blank-labeled urn, small enough to hold in one hand, that kept him from sleeping. Every cough felt like a step closer to fitting inside it. At dawn, he left the village without telling anyone where he was going. The air on the mountain path was sharp and cold, but his lungs fought it with ragged breaths, each inhale rattling like paper about to tear. His satchel was lighter than before, though he had not removed anything, as if the ash pages inside were feeding on more than paper. By midday, the path split, one trail leading toward the cliff with the silent wall, the other climbing higher into the forest. A local hunter had told him in passing about a hermit who lived near the tree line, a shaman who knew the ash and had outlived many winters. The hunter's tone had not been respectful, it had been fearful. The forest here was different from the ones lower down. The trunks were black with age, their bark split into patterns that looked disturbingly like writing. No birds sang. The snow on the ground was thin and gray, as though sifted through charcoal. The shaman's hut appeared suddenly in a clearing, its roof sagging under the weight of years, smoke curling from a single chimney. Outside, a row of wooden stakes bore small cloth bundles tied with twine. The bundles shifted faintly in the wind, but the air was still. Li Wei knocked once on the warped door. It opened without sound. Inside, the shaman sat cross-legged before a low altar. His hair was white and tangled, his eyes sharp and pale, like someone who had been staring into smoke for too long. In front of him burned a single oil lamp whose flame bent toward Li Wei, though there was no draft. "You're marked," the shaman said without greeting. Li Wei stepped closer. "I need to know how to stop it." The shaman's gaze dropped to Li Wei's hands. "Too late to stop, but you can still choose how it ends." Li Wei swallowed. "And if I don't choose?" "You'll be written in full, then shelved." The shaman gestured to the oil lamp. The flame flared, revealing strange shapes carved into the walls, rows upon rows of symbols, some like those on the ash pages, others in languages Li Wei didn't recognize. "There is a ritual, a burning of the binding. If you perform it before the 7th night, the ash will let you go." Li Wei's chest tightened with hope. "What do I need to do?" The shaman's pale eyes fixed on him. "You must give it something greater than the words it already has, something it will take in exchange." What something?" "Memory," the shaman said simply. "You offer the ash your memories, enough to make it full. It will forget your name, your face, your life, and so will you." Li Wei felt the weight of the word settle into his bones. "And if I don't do it?" The shaman leaned forward. "Then it will take all of you, body, name, and soul, and the writing will never stop." For a long moment, the only sound in the hut was the faint hiss of the oil lamp. The shaman reached into the folds of his robe and drew out a small wooden box. Inside lay a thin strip of paper, its surface gray and brittle, as though something waited inside it. "You have 3 nights left," the shaman said, his voice low. "After that, it will write the final stroke." The shaman's warning clung to Li Wei all the way down the mountain. 3 nights left, 3 nights until the last stroke was written. The cold seemed sharper now, biting through his coat as he walked the winding path back to the village. His breath came ragged, the cough breaking through more often, leaving smears of black on the cloth he kept pressed to his mouth. It was no longer just dust. The dark streaks glistened faintly, as if part of him was turning liquid. By the time he reached the village, dusk was settling. Lanterns glowed dimly through the mist, their light swallowed almost instantly by the fog. But even before he reached the library, he knew he would go inside. The pull was heavier than ever, as if the urns themselves were leaning toward him. The doors yielded without resistance this time. The moment he stepped in, he knew something was different. The air was thicker, warmer, as though the shelves had been breathing, and there was a faint hum beneath the silence, a vibration he could feel in his teeth. He walked the aisle slowly, his lantern casting narrow beams over the endless rows of urns. Most were as he remembered, labeled with faded paper, the ink long bled into the fibers. But near the far wall, he saw it, an urn that hadn't been there before. Its surface was pale gray, the ceramic unchipped, the glaze unclouded by time. The label was new, still crisp, its fibers clean. But unlike the others, the label bore no name, only blank space. Li Wei stepped closer. The blank paper seemed to drink the light from his lantern. In the dimness, he thought he saw faint strokes beginning to form, so faint they could have been imagined, and yet they followed the shapes of letters he knew, letters from his own name. A sharp cough doubled him over, his palm hitting the cold wood of the shelf. The fit lasted longer this time, leaving him gasping. When he looked down, His hand was covered in a fine layer of ash. It wasn't from the shelves or the urn, it was from him. The hum in the air deepened, almost like the low chant of voices too far to make out. He turned to leave, but the nearest row seemed longer than before, stretching into shadow. Out of the corner of his eye, something moved, the sway of a robe, the faint glint of a brush's metal ferrule. Li Wei quickened his pace, the hum following him, rising with each step. By the time he reached the door, he felt it behind him, a presence just close enough to breathe on his neck. He didn't turn. Outside, the fog swallowed him whole. The library doors closed on their own with a muffled thud, and in the stillness that followed, he thought he heard the scratch of a brush from somewhere deep inside, writing the first letter on the blank label. The moon rose pale and swollen over the mountains, its light diffused through a fog so dense it seemed carved from stone. It was the 15th night of Ghost Month, the night when, according to the blind woman's vanished voice, the dead walked most freely. Li Wei could feel it before he even reached the temple. The village was silent, every door barred, every lantern snuffed out. The air carried that familiar burnt paper scent, but tonight it was sharper, almost metallic, like blood on hot iron. His cough had become constant, each spasm shaking his ribs. The ash on his palms no longer brushed away. It was part of him now, embedded in the lines of his skin. The library doors were wide open. Inside, the darkness pulsed. It was not the absence of light, but the presence of something thicker, heavier. His lantern flame bent forward as though drawn inward toward the rows of urns that stood impossibly still. Then he heard it. Not one brush, not two, hundreds. The air was alive with the sound. Scrape, lift, pause, scrape. The rhythm was perfect, unbroken, as though every writer moved to the same heartbeat. He stepped into the central aisle, and the sight froze him in place. They were everywhere. Figures in long robes, their faces veiled in shifting veils of ash, filled the spaces between the shelves. Some sat cross-legged on the floor, others stood at low tables, but all of them wrote. Their brushes glowed faintly at the tips, each stroke leaving behind ink blacker than shadow. The pages they worked on were not paper, they were sheets of pressed ash, trembling as if breathing. Li Wei's gaze was drawn upward. The shelves seemed taller tonight, stretching into darkness beyond sight. And there, in the gaps between the upper rows, more figures moved, balanced on nothing, writing even as they hovered. He felt the hum from the night before deepen into a vibration in his bones. The nearest scribe lifted its head, and though its face was hidden, he felt the weight of its attention. It gestured toward a table in the center of the room. There, waiting for him, was a page. The spiral was complete now. The jagged symbol at its center blazed faintly, and the outermost ring of words was no longer half-formed. In his own language, in letters that seemed to curl inward as he read them, it said, "Li Wei will return to the shelves on the 7th night, and the ink will be his breath." The cough hit him so hard he nearly dropped to his knees. When it passed, he felt something warm trickling from the corner of his mouth. Wiping it away, he saw black, thick, wet, almost like oil. His lungs burned, each breath pulling in the ash-filled air like a final draft. The figures around him had stopped writing. Every brush hung suspended in the air. Every veiled head turned toward him. In the sudden silence, he heard one sound, the slow, deliberate placing of a ceramic urn on wood. When he looked, he saw it, the nameless urn, no longer blank. His name was written on the label in perfect black strokes. Li Wei stumbled backward from the sight of his name on the urn, but the shelves behind him seemed to shift, closing off retreat. The air was too thick now. Every breath pulled heat into his chest, scorching as it went down. His vision pulsed at the edges, shapes bending in ways that made no sense. On the table, the spiral page lay open, the jagged central symbol seeming to rise slightly from the surface. The letters around it, some from the ancient composite script, others unmistakably from his own language, were no longer chaotic. They had aligned into a precise order, the loops and arcs falling into place as if a lock had just been turned. Li Wei's eyes traced the spiral inward, each ring of text pulling him closer. The translation formed in his mind without effort, as though the meaning had been waiting there all along, sealed inside him until this moment. The reader shall take the writer's place. The writer shall become the ash. The ash shall bind the soul to the words, and the words shall live forever. Those who learn the script become its ink. Those who speak it give their breath to the page. Those who finish it are never heard again. The cough came again, violent this time, doubling him over. Something heavy hit the floor, a thick clot of black ash from his lungs. It broke apart to reveal a perfect miniature symbol from the page. His own body was beginning to write itself out. When he straightened, one of the faceless scribes was standing closer than before, brush in hand. It dipped the brush into a small urn and began to write on a fresh ash sheet. Each stroke was slow, deliberate. When the figure turned the page toward him, Li Wei saw that it was not writing another curse, it was writing his life. Moments he had forgotten, faces from his childhood, the first time he held the brush. The script was preserving him as it prepared to erase him. The hum in the room deepened until it was almost a voice. He couldn't tell if it came from the shelves, the urns, or from inside his own chest. It spoke without sound, pressing the meaning into his skull. Your breath for the words, your body for the ash, your name for the shelf. Li Wei clutched the satchel at his side. Inside were the 2 pages he had taken and the shaman's thin strip of ritual paper. His mind raced. If the translation was true, destroying the pages might sever the script's hold, but doing so without the offering the shaman had warned about, he didn't know what the ash would do to him then. The nearest scribe stepped forward, extending the brush toward him, the tip glistening. It was not an attack. It was an invitation, a contract. He heard his own voice, raw and cracked, whisper into the silence. If I refuse. The scribe dipped the brush once more, wrote a single new line in the spiral's outer ring, and turned it toward him. Refusal is still writing. Li Wei's hands shook. The spiral page was no longer just a curse, it was a map. And the center of it, the jagged symbol, was a door, and it was open. The jagged symbol at the spiral center seemed to breathe, its edges curling like smoke, the negative space within it drawing him forward. The air in the library thickened until it felt more like water than air, pressing against his skin. Every faceless scribe had stopped writing. They stood in complete stillness, brushes poised, their veiled heads tilted toward him in silent expectation. Li Wei's chest burned with each breath. The cough came again, but this time it didn't end in dust. It ended in a long, tearing exhale that left him gasping on his knees. When he looked down, the ash that fell from his mouth formed the faint outline of a character, one stroke away from completion. The shaman's words pounded in his mind. Give it your memories, or it will take everything. His hand went to his satchel. Inside, he felt the brittle weight of the 2 ash pages and the shaman's thin strip of ritual paper. The strip seemed to hum faintly against his fingertips, as though it knew it was close to being used. He set the lantern down on the table beside the spiral page. Its light made the ink gleam wetly, though he knew it could not be fresh. And yet each time he blinked, new strokes appeared, filling in spaces that had not been there a moment before. His name was no longer just written once, it was everywhere, at the edges, between the lines, even hidden in the curves of ancient symbols. The faceless scribe stepped forward, the brush in its right hand, an urn in its left. It placed the urn on the table beside him. The label was complete now, Li Wei in deep black strokes. The meaning was clear. His time was almost over. He pulled out the ritual strip. The moment it touched the spiral page, the air shifted. The hum in the room fractured into whispers, countless voices speaking in languages he half recognized but could not fully understand. The scribes stirred for the first time, their brushes trembling. The jagged symbol at the center of the page flickered like a dying ember. Li Wei struck a match. The fire took to the ritual strip instantly, curling the edges in orange light. He held it over the spiral page, the flames licking downward, when something inside him hesitated. If he burned it, his memories would go. Every face, every word, every part of himself that made him him would vanish. He would survive, but he would be an empty shell. The whispers turned urgent, like a tide pulling him toward the decision. His hand trembled over the page. He thought of the blind woman's warning, the fisherman's fear, the shaman's pale eyes. He thought of the blank label, of the heavy cough, of the ink in his breath. And then, from somewhere deep in the fog of his mind, came another thought, colder, sharper. What if I took the brush instead? The fire in the ritual strip burned closer to his fingers. He had seconds to decide. The scribe held out the brush. The library waited. The flame of the ritual strip licked his fingers. Li Wei's grip loosened, and the paper fell, curling into blackened fragments before it touched the floor. With his other hand, he reached forward and took the brush. It was warm, not with the heat of fire, but with the heat of breath, as if someone had been holding it for centuries. The bristles were black, glistening, though no ink pot stood nearby. The moment his fingers closed fully around the handle, the hum in the library stopped. Every scribe lowered their brush. The air thickened into silence so absolute that he could hear his own heartbeat echoing off the shells. The faceless figure before him stepped back, inclining its head as if acknowledging his acceptance. The urn with his name remained on the table. Its lid shifted, just slightly, as if stirred by something moving inside. The pull came almost immediately, not physical, but inside his chest, in his lungs, his blood, his thoughts. His body wanted to bend over the ash page, to write, to continue what had been started long before he arrived. His hand trembled, resisting, but the bristles touched the page anyway. The moment the first stroke landed, something left him. His breath eased, but only because it was no longer his. It flowed down the brush into the page, staining the ash deeper than black. The spiral widened with every stroke, new words blooming in perfect, alien symmetry. Somewhere between one breath and the next, he felt memories peeling away. His childhood, his studies, the streets of Chengdu, until they were nothing but faint shadows. When the page was full, he set the brush down. The ash pages he had taken were gone from his satchel. In their place was a single fresh sheet, still warm, with writing that pulsed faintly, as if alive. The faceless scribes turned away, returning to their work. The hum began again, steady and eternal. The figure nearest to him picked up the urn with his name and carried it toward a high shelf. Li Wei watched as it slid into place between two older urns. It looked no different from the others now, except for the ink, still dark, still wet. The heavy doors closed on their own. The latch clicked. The library was sealed. Outside, the fog thickened over the village. The streets were empty, the windows dark. By morning, the temple would stand silent again, its doors locked, its shelves a little fuller. And somewhere, far above the floor in the dim light, an urn with the name Li Wei would wait, silent and patient, for the next traveler to hear the sound of brush on paper. The fog had never lifted from the village. Weeks had passed, or perhaps only days. In this place, time did not move in ways the living could measure. The villagers went about their routines with the same quiet dread, avoiding the path to the library, as if it were a wound that would never heal. One morning, a new traveler appeared on that path. She was young, carrying a pack that spoke of long journeys and curiosity that hadn't yet been worn thin by caution. She had come from far beyond the mountains, following a trail of half-whispered rumors about a place where lost languages still lived. In the market, she asked about the blackened temple at the edge of the village. The stallholders looked away. One old man told her it was locked, abandoned, nothing worth her time. But when she turned, she saw him glancing toward it, just for a moment, the same wary flicker Li Wei had seen before. That evening, when the sun bled out behind the ridges and the mist thickened into a pale wall, the traveler found herself standing before the library's doors. They were closed, but not barred. She hesitated, listening. Somewhere inside, a faint sound drifted through the stillness. Brush on paper. The strokes were slow, deliberate, patient, the work of someone who knew they had all the time in the world. She stepped closer, pressing her palm against the scorched wood. It was warm. The sound continued, steady and unbroken, drawing her hand to the latch. Her breath came faster, fogging in the cold air. She told herself she would only look inside for a moment, that she had nothing to fear from an empty building. The door yielded without resistance. The air within was cool, heavy with the scent of extinguished fire. Rows of urns stretched into the dimness, their paper labels swaying almost imperceptibly in a wind that wasn't there. She stepped forward, her boots whispering over a floor dusted in gray. At the far end of the aisle, a table waited. On it lay a single page, pale against the darkness. She reached for it without thinking. The characters were strange, curling in ways she didn't understand. But at the very center, one line was clear, written in her own language. The next name begins here. Behind her, the doors closed with a soft, final click. And somewhere high on the shelves, the urn labeled Li Wei sat in silence. Inside, the ash shifted ever so slightly, as if adjusting its weight, making room for what was to come.